Welcome to News Laundry. I'm Alpana Kishore, and our guest today is Laleh Khadivi, who has written a book called The Age of Orphans. Laleh is Iranian American, Kurdish American actually, and you have written your first book about the Kurds in Iran. So tell me about your, the thing that strikes me about being Kurdish American or Iranian American, especially Iranian American, is when you land in America, you are also, you're a minority again, and you're a minority. The country, the United States, has a declared policy of hostility towards your home country. In Iran, you're a Kurd, and you have your own set of problems being Kurdish in Iran. So how does that, are there similarities in both the areas?
There are similarities in the sense that the state is defining your relationship with your internal identity. And it is saying that because Iran and the US are at loggerheads about a number of issues, then you yourself should be in conflict internally, which I do not believe in. And I think that as long as you can sort of slip into a place that is based on your less on your passport and less on your citizenship status and more on the traditions, identities, cultures you have been raised with, however various they may be, the better it is for you.
You know, I was reading on your website. There's a documentary that you've made, and there's a trailer or teaser for your new book, your next book, which is also it's a trilogy. You're working on a trilogy. So this is the second of the trilogy you're going to release, where you have talked about voices of migration, and you have said. You have asked questions like, when home feels like home, and what do you miss? So in a sense, when the migrant has gone and left something behind, he has to assimilate in a new place. So where do you start having loyalty to the new place? When do you actually become an American citizen, where you can identify with American politics, American traditions, maybe baseball, you know, secular American traditions, or feel this is home and this is who I am? Or can you never do that?
It varies by person. I can only speak to my own experience. The film is largely because I'm curious about how people do make that change in loyalties, how they do open up their hearts to completely different cultures and claim them gradually as their own. There's a writer in Canada who has this book in which she says, not until you birth a child in a place, and not until you bury your dead in a place can you call that place home.
All right.
And I really do believe that it is those very sort of basic, organic activities that tie us to the soil. Beyond that, you can just keep moving. You don't have to actually lay down roots.
So what you're saying is that there is no need for rootedness. Is that what you're saying?
You can keep moving. I don't think you should keep moving, but it is possible because of transportation.
But you lose something in that.
You do lose,
a lot in that.
You lose a lot, and I think you realize what you lose when you do have a child, or you do bury your dead, or you establish a life somewhere that is a life that feels secure and harmonious to you, whatever that may be. The minute you have to forego that, you are losing your sense of safety in the world. And that is sad. And it is not to say it can't be recreated somewhere else. These things just take time. Birth and death are long spans.
Right. Give us a sense of being an ethnic Kurd in Iran today. Would you, you've gone back.
Yes, I can't really answer to that question because in all of my travels back to Iran, it has been with my mother. All of her family continues to live there. And I do not have access to the Kurdish experience in the sense that my father does not go back to Iran. And
Why
he
is
is
that?
the Kurd. I think he left under sort of I think he just doesn't have the desire to. You know, I think his life journey is one that continues to move forward. There are very many different definitions. There's the immigrant, the emigrant, the migrant. My mother is much more the migrant. She goes in a circle. She has left Iran, she returns. She goes to America, she goes back to Iran. My father is an emigrant, and that is a one direction. You leave and you never return. And for me, the experience of Iran has been largely through her eyes and her life and her family, who are all still there. And the Kurdish experience has been one that I have had outside of the country with my extended family in Germany and in the United States who are Kurds who left
But which are good countries to be hosted in.
Great countries to be hosted in.
So,
very open, warm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But say you were in Turkey or you were in somewhere else in the area where you were not welcome.
Right.
Being Kurdish has its own set of rules and
it's interesting.
ideas.
I was in Turkey, the eastern edge of Turkey, right on the border of Iran, and I was in a city called Van, and I was on a boat, a very small boat, going to a little tourist island in the middle of this lake. And there was a Kurdish family on the boat, and I was trying to speak to them. I don't have any Turkish, and I used a little bit of Kurdish, and the grandmother was sitting underneath a Turkish flag, and she pointed to the flag and she spit. To let me know exactly how she felt about the Turks. And that's when I realized that the Kurdish experience is different. Across a certain mountain range, it's different than it is on the other side. The Iranian Kurds do not have that level of animosity and tension because they've largely been left alone. They haven't pushed for independence, and so they haven't been persecuted.
Right.
But the Turkish Kurds have an entirely, completely different identity. They want a status. They want to have Kurdish schools. They want to have access to Kurdish media, and the Turks say no. So they are sticking their head out from the sand, and the Turks have to respond to that. In Iran, that's not the case.
Okay.
They don't argue for very much, and they don't get repressed.
But yet your book is about this kind
Now, previously it was different.
This is previous.
Yes, right when Khomeini came to power was the very end of that sort of voicing of Kurdish identity.
Right.
And the second book that I wrote takes place in this moment in history where, right after the Iranian Revolution, Khomeini wanted the Kurds and other ethnic tribes to know who was in power, and went to Baluchistan and went to the Kurdish region and went to the Lur region and kind of tapped into a particular fear that he needed to have there by having random massacres, and then pulled back and let them know that independence was not a possibility, splitting off from the state was not. If you do not like the regime, that is not, it's not available for you to voice your concern. And that was the end of it.
And so they made their peace with that?
They didn't make peace per se, but they pulled back on having a voice of resistance that comes and goes in waves, you know.
Okay. So the reasons that you migrated, or your family migrated, or left Iran in 1979 when the Islamic Revolution came about, was it due to the fact that you were Kurdish, or was it due to the fact that you were part of the elite that was no longer, the position it had under the Shah was not what it was going to be under Khomeini?
Well, I think that a little bit of both. I was young, but I do know the story of leaving, and I think it wasn't because we were part of the elite. Our position was not going to be served to have been under the Shah. He was incredibly repressive in his own right and terrible to the Kurds. And I think that leaving was more a sense of feeling a dark curtain fall on your country. And you do not know what life is going to be like behind that curtain. And the people who stayed gambled. What is it going to be? We'll take the risk because we want to remain a part of this community, identity, place. And the people who left had a sense that the gamble wasn't worth it.
I was going to ask you, which way did that gamble turn out? I mean, in terms of not that the ones who stayed back went through repression or hell or whatever, but just that they managed to retain the cosmos that they wanted to, their identity, their sense of culture, being part of a nation, versus those who went away and also wanted to keep a certain sense of cosmos, but more oriented towards safety, towards retaining the family in a secure, peaceful environment, or getting away from the darkness, as you put it. How do you look at the parallel lives of both?
It's very easy for me to look at that because I have a cousin who lives in Esfahan who is 13 months older than I am, and we have grown up together, but in different parts of the world. And hers is the family who stayed, and her life is the life of someone who did not leave, and my life is the life of someone who left. And if I look at the differences in our lives, I can see that, and I hate to be so calm about this, but I really do believe I can say that there are things that she has in terms of this cosmos that you speak of, the intimacy of family, the proximity of culture and tradition that is very old and ties back to a a previous
Geography.
world and a
Yes.
geography, all of that is settled for her.
Yes.
Her ability to work in the world, her ability to step out of her role as a woman and become a person, her ability to get a job on her own or graduate from university in a subject that she prefers rather than has to take, is minimal. So she has these wonderful, beautiful, sensuous benefits to having stayed, and she has lost these things that are just not available to Iranian women. Whereas I have gone into great, deep anxiety over being in exile and, you know, a homeless person, as was mentioned at the panel today, and my adolescence is very fraught with all of these issues. But I grew through it and I became a writer, which is not something that in my family had ever been done before. I also became a woman who was able to travel the world and a woman who was able to teach and find education on her own and not just through the routes that had been set previous. Like I said before, 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other. It's good and bad.
Let me then ask you, your second generation in America. I mean, well, first generation in a sense, but you went there when you were so small. You know, you were a 2-year-old when I think you left, 3-year-old.
Yeah.
So really, in a sense, your growing up has been in a Western
Yes.
atmosphere, in a Western environment. What do you miss about Iran?
I miss the...
And how can you miss it? Since
Well, I visited.
yeah, but in the sense that it's not something you had and so you lost.
Yeah.
It's just something you'd never had, but you can still miss it.
Well, I do believe that I had it and I lost it insofar as I was raised by a mother who had it and lost
Okay.
it. And so through her, I have
The
felt
sense
a
of
lot
loss?
of the loss.
Okay.
You know, through her, I have felt a lot of the absences that she has experienced and a lot of the things that she has
What would it
gained.
be? Give me a sense of
Family.
that.
I think when you go to a culture that is so incredibly family-based, not commerce-based and not ambition-based, but this thing that is loyal first and foremost to the structure of the inside of the house, I miss that. And I miss their intimacy that she would refer to, and also that I experience when I go to Iran. It's this very intense, unquestioning closeness.
Yes.
There is no question about how you treat your mother.
Right.
Or your father, or your grandparents. You cannot sit in a room with your back to anyone older than you. And these rules are very relaxing. You know, on some level, it's like these people are your family and you have to love them. In the United States, all of that is up for question. You can choose a variety of families. They're not just the one that belong to you by blood.
Yes.
You can create new traditions and new identities. And while liberating, this is also very stressful.
It's
and also
anxious.
brings a lot of anxiety into the home. And in Iran, the homes do not have that level of anxiety. In my family's home, I can't speak to all of them.
There's also a sense of what your protagonist in the first book, you know, I think it ends on that note. Who is this Iran? What is this Iran? You know, are they simply waves of history that come through all of our nations, through India as well? I mean, invasions, repeated invasions through India.
Yeah.
Some of them from Iran, some of them from Central Asia, from you know, Afghanistan. In the sense that you know, one brutal regime is replaced by another, and so everyone tries to create their own Iran or their own India, and there is something that stays at the core, which is just a witness to all these changing things and remains there. So, you know,
I like
do you
that
feel that
idea.
way about it? When you question, when you say, who is this Iran? What is this Iran?
Right.
Is it invisible, or is it really this core? And that could work, your answer could work for India as well, or any
Yeah.
other country that's been through bouts of invasion
Right.
and regime change.
These old
and,
nations,
these old,
these old
cultures,
empires and
Right.
regimes. Yeah. I think that it is the mythology. That is the thing that is at the core. I think there is this constant storytelling that people have done since the beginning of time to understand their relationship in the cosmos. And those stories are born of the environments. They're born of the land and the weather and the relationship to crops and animals
Yes,
that are
yes.
locally based.
Yes.
And those stories are the thing that we understand about a place and ourselves in a place. Nations, empires, rulers, wars, all of that moves through.
Yes.
It's like, it is like on some level weather. It doesn't
Yeah.
stick. What sticks is our connection to these old symbols, to these old senses of how man came to the planet and how woman came to the planet and how love exists. And the poets tend to capture this, and they tend to be the voice of this sort of story, or the Bibles, or those big books. That stays. The polity
Keeps changing.
moves right through.
In your book, you've talked about fragmentation along ethnic lines, which, I mean, that's a passage I read about that sort of struck me as being very interesting. The innocence of this boy who is a Kurd but gets enlisted into the army, into the Iranian army, and his bonding with his fellow recruits who have different ethnicities, but they all come together, and there is this precious innocence in the beginning where you're just dealing with each other as people. But then, later things harden and the divisions start along ethnic lines. Was there such an innocence in Iran? I mean, in the Iran that your mother might talk about, pre-Islamic revolution, does it still exist? Is there something of that?
Not in Iran. I think that in the pre-state, like before it became the state of Iran, there was that innocence. Just like in Turkey or perhaps in India, before a flag was assigned, before the lines were drawn, there was a way that people had to deal with each other, and sometimes it was through warfare, and sometimes it was through trade, but there was a way that people had to deal with each other that recognized their differences and did not ask for them to be aligned. They were allowed them.
Would you say that role was played by the coming of Islam in Persia?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a pre-Islamic past that is very strong in Iran.
The Zoroastrian.
Yes, there is a sense of being a civilization before Islam came, and Iran's position in the world, being the only Shia nation, the strong Shia nation, makes it a symbol of something for lots of other people. I mean, for instance, Shias in India look up to Iran as the center of their religious universe. So it's a leader, and yet it has something that goes way before.
Yeah.
How does that affect the whole sense of being Iranian?
I think the sense of being Iranian is a very layered thing. I think when you come, like India or China, from these old empires, you collect a lot of things on top of those mythologies. You collect a lot of things, other narratives on top of them that stay or go, depending on how history has it. But the Islamic narrative that came after the Zoroastrians stayed and continues to stay, and it makes the Iranians loyal to a number of different storylines. So when the Shah came to power, he evoked the Zoroastrian symbology as part of the Iranian history, which wasn't entirely true. The empire's borders were very fluid, so some of that was in and some of that wasn't. And then when Khomeini came to power, he got rid of that mythology and pushed it to the side and brought in the Islamic mythology and said, this is the story that we believe. And the Iranians, on a day-to-day basis, the everyday people who buy bread and live in houses and go to school, kept all the stories at once, because you cannot just tell a people to stop believing in this.
So that the thing we talked about, the core remaining as regimes keep changing around it, that stays.
Yes.
And that you think has stayed in Iran currently? There is something below the layer of, the
what is happening now. Yes, exactly. When the Shiites leave, there will be another narrative that goes on top of all of this, and some people will keep the Shiite narrative along with the narrative before. It's just a question of not allegiances, but a question of what stories play in your head. And you can't get rid of the stories that were there before.
Or you keep what you like?
You keep what you like.
Okay. You've also talked about how artificial nationality is, and how tribals or communities may disregard those. Which, nationality as a suspicious construct, as something to be not trusted, sort of untrustworthy. It's of a singular, dominating type. But suppose we talk about, a multi-ethnic nationality, nation state, where there's room, there's space for religions, like the US, like India.
Or Italy. Or,
where specifically there are large number of communities, many different languages. I mean, even in Italy has the Italian language, which is something that binds everybody together. The small nation states of Europe are all built around language primarily. But in countries, even say like the old Soviet Union, where there were nationalities, languages, ethnicities of all hues. In India, the same. In the US, the same. how does this mistrust of nationality fit there? Because there's space. If you want to practice your culture, your tradition, you want to be Iranian in America, you can be.
I think my suspicion of nationality is mostly directed at a particular time period between the 20s and the 60s in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, when the colonial powers were beginning to remove themselves. And in the absence, they left behind these philosophies and notions of statehood.
Yes.
And those states were artificial.
Okay.
Those states were drawn with very odd lines.
Yes, absolutely.
And those people were given loyalties that made no sense to them,
Yes.
and made to sing songs and go to schools and become part of these communities that had nothing to do with who they are. And so when you say that they have failed, of course they failed, because they were never a good idea in the first place.
They're never real.
That is the state that I'm suspicious of.
But
the older
evolve,
idea of the state, which is the 18th century, 17th century sort of Lockean idea of the nation state, is this thing that takes everybody under its wings and allows for X, Y, and Z identities to coexist. Everybody, however, pays taxes to the same king, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to persecute if you don't try to break away. That's okay.
You're
I'm okay with that. It only works in the West.
Are you a good American citizen? Let's put it that way.
Yes and no. I'm very grateful to the United States. I mean, I am in Jaipur because I was able to go to certain schools and have certain ideas and to argue with my professors and not go to jail.
Right.
So in that way, yes, why not? But in another way, I mean, you have to be suspicious of wherever you live.
Right.
Nationalism is disgusting, like patriotism is also disgusting.
Yes.
You have to be an individual first before you become part of this larger, encompassing clan.
Okay, last question. In your session, you talked about the stairs, which to you seem to be, something we discussed, that you seem to be drawn towards them because they're the opposite of what you've been. And you've had a life of moving, of many houses, of many transfers and, transmigrations and settlings and so on. As opposed to that, somebody who stays so rooted to the soil, somebody who just can't bear to leave. I think you talked about Syria. There are bombs being dropped, but the Syrians won't leave. I mean, large parts of them
have,
but
some have not.
Some have not. And that's really, I mean, you look at the cities; they've been bombed to hell.
Right.
But there's still people living there.
There are.
So how do you reconcile that with your ideas of being a global soul, for instance, who's had access to everything, who belongs nowhere, but gains from moving on?
And loses.
And loses too, yes.
I understand that there is a lot of tragedy in my, modern identity.
Yes.
And there's a lot of tragedy in this identity of not leaving. You keep your family in a place where bombs are falling. You are responsible if somebody dies.
We say bombs are not happening.
Right.
But you just stay.
Yeah. I think that's amazing.
You stay and it's your culture. The mountain is your mountain. The soil is your soil.
There's a harmony there.
Your songs come from there and your poetry.
There is a harmony there, and I feel like you are, as long as you are living in harmony, without whatever your definition of that is, then why would you leave?
So leaving is a state of being propelled, being pushed.
Possibly. There is the push of the leaving, that is definitely what
Something
a lot of people...
pushes you, yes.
There's also the pull, which I write about in my second book, which is a kid in this Kurdish region in Iran who watches movies all day long. And all he wants to do is go see the worlds where those movies take place. And all he does is live in a village with no running water or electricity. And so there's a tension there. So there is the push of the extreme situation. Then there is this pull that the 20th century has introduced to us of curiosity.
But curiosity can be satisfied if you can come back.
It can. It can, but sometimes you might not want to come back because whatever it is that you saw in the films actually exists, and why would you ever leave it?
Okay, Laleh Khadivi, thank you so much for being with us.
Yes, thank you.